Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Rise of the Phoenix. This video is going to be a bit different from my normal videos. Somebody on my Discord server suggested that it might be worthwhile for me to talk about the most recent patch, the patch notes for that. It has been quite a controversial patch to say the least, so I figured I would take a few minutes and share my opinion on it. Hopefully you guys are interested in it, and maybe the devs will listen to the community and walk back some of the changes. I think there is a chance. They did mention something that, like, we're looking into your feedback. We want to take your opinion into consideration and all that good stuff. Anyways, this video is not going to have a fancy intro. We're not going to start off in the game or anything like that. We'll just quickly go through the patch notes and I'll share my opinion. So we're going to ignore this stuff up here because it doesn't really matter for balance. Commander skill adjustments. Kirune's Sandstorm was changed to randomly apply one of the following debuffs: minus 50% damage or madness for 2 rounds. I assume that means minus 50% damage. I really need to see how this is worded in game. Either way, I think this is probably a buff to Karun, although I think it's currently bugged right now where the madness only lasts 1 round instead of 2. I'm pretty sure I saw somebody point that out in the bug reports, or at least the tooltip says 1 round instead of 2. I haven't dug through a combat log of Karun since the patch. Overall, I think this is somewhat of a buff for him because Sandstorm and one of his titles both applied stuns to people, and they effectively canceled each other out, because I'm not sure that there's any instance where 2 different versions of the same effect can stack. So, like, if you get hit with 2 madnesses, you can't be more madnessed, right? If you get hit with 2 stuns, you can't be double stunned. Same thing works for follow-up, avoidance, all of those things. I think whichever effect is applied first is always the one that takes precedent and will not be overwritten. That is particularly important when it comes to commanders that have multi-round madness skills. You do not want them to have madness helms if there is a chance that the helm will go off before the skill, in which case the helm's 1 round madness would actually overwrite the skill's multiple round madness. I don't know if this is going to be enough to bump him up any tiers, but at least he now has access to stuns and madness, which is a somewhat unique thing in a commander, and very few commanders have the ability to mitigate both simultaneously, so he might be able to catch some people off guard. Baruthiel, I guess this is a buff, I don't know. She still seems probably not very good overall. She's just a very weird commander. I'm really not sure how people are supposed to use her. Thranduil, somewhat of a buff. Unit adjustments. This is the controversial part. This is probably the part of the patch that people were the most up in arms about. Actually, it might be the only part of the patch that people were up in arms about, to be honest. And it's probably what you guys truly want my opinion on. So the Ram Rider and the Guardian, both of which are good side T3 units, have a new skill that can be leveled up. At 10 of 10, it reduces burn damage received by minus 50%. So it's 5% per level. Of course, by the mid and late game, you're going to just have it maxed out anyway. And this was super controversial because a lot of the evil side commanders really rely, particularly the Nazgul commanders and Gothmog, really relied on Alchemists. And when you combine Heatproof Skin with something like White Council or the Lonely Mountain that the dwarves have, that at max 15 to 15 points, it also gives 50%. If you have 2 instances of that, you are reducing fire damage, burn damage, I believe, by effectively 75%. I don't think they stack additively. I do believe they stack multiplicatively, but I don't actually have the math to back myself up on that. So if somebody knows the true math, please comment on this video or somewhere. Hit me up on Discord. I would love to know the exact nitty-gritty math. So evil players really saw this as a huge nerf to, like, every single evil faction, some of the most popular and most powerful evil commanders, because the devs are essentially handing good factions on a silver platter a counter to the primary thing that evil factions like to do, which is burn damage. And kind of an insult to injury sort of thing is they put it on T3 units. And it's not like Guardians were bad. It's not like people weren't using Guardians or Ram Riders, right? It's not like these are bad units that are now have like a niche use to counter burn damage. These are like already really good units that now just also get to counter burn damage. So I'd like to kind of explain my thoughts on both sides of things. I'll be upfront and say I do think that this change, at least at the 50% level, is too much and potentially unnecessary and quite punishing. However, to be fair, I think that if you take a step back and look at things from a more objective point of view of game balance as a whole, I do think it is fair to say that the Witch King is a very problematic commander. And I think this is probably what the nerf was truly targeting. I'm not the devs. I don't know exactly what their full goal was, but I have a feeling that they were really targeting the Witch King in particular with this. I don't think the reason that the Witch King is really, really oppressive, I don't think it has to do necessarily with the Alchemists specifically. I think it has more to do with the interaction between things like Orthank's Devilry, which can give up to an 80%, I believe it's 80% chance each round for a unit to cause maximum damage. The interaction between that, Alchemists, and his Convener ability, which gives 2 attacks and initiative, and the initiative being important because Alchemists aren't particularly quick units, so a lot of times they're going to act second without that initiative. I think it's like just the perfect storm of those 3 things, where some Witch Kings out there have the ability for 80% of the time for their Alchemists to be causing max damage, and that is like a 3.5x damage multiplier on Alchemists, even before the 300% burn damage is applied, because of their ridiculous, it's like 4 to 14 base damage range. And then you're going to have, if you're a whale that has Orthank's max strength and max refined, you're probably going to have a weapon that gives +3 attack as well. So I think the real core of the issue is the fact that you can make a unit that has a super wide damage range. So it's like a high risk, high reward unit. And then you implement something into the game that, for basically no drawback, like the only drawback is the fact that you're using Orthank's Devilry and not some other accessory. For like basically no drawback, you're allowing those units to hit those maximum damage numbers almost all the time. Let's be fair, 80% of the time is almost all the time. And then on top of that, you're adding the ability for them to hit twice in those first rounds of combat. So I do think that the Witch King, in those specific circumstances, which are pretty rare, there's not that many people out there that have a fully strengthened, fully refined Orthank's Devilry with like a +3 attack weapon, probably that has melee damage on it, yada yada yada. Like, they exist, but they're pretty rare, and they are very, very oppressive, to be fair. But I think for the average player, it was not a problem, because like, let's take another example let's look at Gothmog for a second. So Gothmog's Respect 3 ability, the crippled, or title I should say, says like 60% of the time your units are going to do max damage each round. And Alchemists on Gothmog are very strong, but I don't think they are oppressively strong. And by oppressively strong, I mean like nearly unbeatable in a 1v1 scenario or even a 1v2 scenario. They're super strong on Gothmog, but I've never thought like, man, there's no way I could ever beat this guy, right? Like, sometimes if you look at some Witch King logs, it's like, a bajillion kills and a dozen deaths or whatever. But Gothmog doesn't have the ability to also give Alchemists the first hit and 2 attacks in those early rounds. So I do think there is a problem, I do think that this was not the correct solution. You can also look at, if you want like a counterexample for good side, Gandalf the Grey is also an extremely oppressive commander. And a lot of that, in my opinion, has to do with how ridiculous he is in the early rounds of combat, with things like White Council, reducing damage, Mithrandir, reducing the amount of damage enemies deal, Wizard for 1 point, you just get to stun 2 things, Convener, all of these things really add up to where in those early rounds of combat, Gandalf the Grey completely shreds people, just like Witch King does. The difference being Witch King is way more of a glass cannon style, where his units are just like completely eradicating you. Gandalf the Grey is more of a let me get a really solid advantage in the first rounds of combat and then carry that, snowball that into a long-term advantage in the later rounds. So I think if this had just been added to like T4 Iron Warriors, I don't think it would be nearly as big of a deal. Or if they had added it, I don't know what good side unit they would add it to, maybe Eagles or something. I don't know. I think if they had added it to like a neutral unit, it wouldn't be as big of a deal. The issue is now you have entire factions of players who are feeling extremely punished and feeling like they can no longer run the army setups that they have been running, because any good player anywhere at any time can just decide, hey, I'm going to go train some Ram Riders and Guardians and just completely counter you. I think some of the uproar has been a bit unwarranted, but that's not really in the scope of this video. Overall, I like I've said before, I would say this is not a particularly great change because I don't think it solves the root cause of why like the Witch King in particular was so powerful. And we'll finish up the video real quickly. Increase the resource cost of T3, T4 units. I think by my quick math, I checked some of the resource values that I had data on. I don't have data on every single unit. I think it's roughly like a 15 to 20% resource cost increase, just depending from unit to unit, which is actually quite substantial. I think this is going to make the early game transition from T2 to T3 units even more difficult, and people might have to get used to running full T2 armies for longer than they have been. I also think this is going to make resource control in long wars super important. So I think it's going to be advantageous for factions like Mordor and Erebor in particular, Lindon to a certain extent, who can kind of have like their core homeland resources locked away behind a whole bunch of other territories, whereas factions that have to frequently fight on multiple fronts, their resources are going to be way less protected. Once they start losing their good tiles, I think they're going to really feel the impact of that. Overall, I think this change is actually good because, in my experience throughout seasons that I've played, by the mid and late game, I just have so many resources that it doesn't matter. And so I think it makes for more interesting early game decisions on when do you transition from your T2 army into your T3 army, and then when do you bring in your T4s, since they're, at first super long to train and very expensive. So at what point do you use those? And I think in the mid and late games, I don't know if a 15 to 20% increase would be enough. I almost think they should tie this to like the server progression potentially, to have like an even steeper increase later in the seasons. Because I feel like I've just always had in the late game just so many resources that I'm not even going to care about a 15 to 20% increase. Right now on my season 1 restart server, it's hitting me a little bit, but I think with another day or two of farming out like 260 and 300 tiles, I think I'm probably just going to forget that this even exists at that point. So, all right, guys, that was a bit of a different video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about the patch notes down in the video. I assume most of you are going to say, yes, it's a super bad patch, but if you do want to comment, please be somewhat reasonable. Don't like personally attack the devs of the game or anything. They're just doing their job, and hopefully they listen to the community feedback and change this in some manner. That's it, guys. I'll catch you in the next one. Rise of the Phoenix, over and out.